Hi everyone, and welcome to Chapter 15 lecture. So in Chapter 15, we're still in this Unit 4 content, so still kind of talking about what I call some of the more social sides of the science of nutrition. So Chapter 15 will focus on some issues around food safety and food-related illnesses. And we'll also start to talk a little bit more about food-related technologies. So we'll kind of introduce the concept of food science and see how food science has kind of affected our food production systems in modern times, and also talk about any implications for health or health concerns that might have. So for the first part of the lecture, we'll focus on food-related illnesses. So this term foodborne illness, kind of more colloquially, we say food poisoning, but foodborne illness we can define as a symptom or even a full-blown disorder that comes from ingesting food or water that has been contaminated with pathogenic microorganisms. And we'll talk a little bit more about what these microorganisms might be, or potentially by ingesting a toxic secretion made by this organism, or a toxic chemical. So in the United States, it's estimated that about 48 million people are exposed to and experience a foodborne illness each year. So in recent years, I guess I would even say in recent maybe decades, maybe the last 2 decades, food-related illnesses have become a pretty major public health concern. So just a little bit about how the body responds to these contaminants or these microorganisms or the toxins that they're producing. So basically, the body's going to respond with various immune functions. So we have an immune response to these foreign organisms or their foreign toxic chemicals. So we'll see, let me pull up my highlighter, we'll see antimicrobial enzymes in our saliva. You might remember we talked a little bit about that. So our saliva is basically kind of a first line of defense. If we actually swallow the food down into the stomach, you might recall we have hydrochloric acid in the stomach, and the job of hydrochloric acid is, well, on the one hand, we talked about it's supposed to help denature proteins so that we can digest them more completely. But the other reason we have hydrochloric acid in the stomach is actually to kill off any foreign microorganisms that might make their way all the way down into our stomach. We also have other sort of lines of defense, if you will, from the immune system. So basic things like vomiting or having diarrhea. These are, your body's doing this for a reason. And in this case, the reason is to try to expel, like quickly get rid of and get out of your body any of these foreign or potentially toxic substances that might have come in. And then if the toxin or the microorganism itself actually manages to begin affecting your, make its way, say, into your bloodstream and begin affecting your cells, then we'll really see the leukocytes or the white blood cells of the immune system become activated. And so when we see white blood cell activity, we will commonly see symptoms like fever, fatigue, potentially even muscle aches and nausea. So depending on the severity of the foodborne illness or the toxin that came into the body, we would see a variety of these things or a combination of these things. In some cases, again, the microorganism could be fully kind of extinguished by the antimicrobial enzymes in the saliva and the hydrochloric acid in the stomach. So in some cases, we might ingest something that could have been potentially poisonous or toxic, but our first line immune system responded pretty well, and so we kind of passed by without hardly even noticing it. But then obviously in other cases, it can become pretty severe and we can experience pretty severe symptoms. So really anyone is at risk of being exposed to or sort of ingesting something that could cause a foodborne illness. But certainly anyone whose immune system is either compromised or developing would be at a greater risk. So certainly fetuses actually, and sometimes we don't think about that, but if a person is pregnant and carrying a fetus, if the pregnant person gets exposed to any sort of food-related illnesses, actually the fetus is at a pretty high risk, depending on the contaminant, because the fetus hardly has its own immune system at that point. And then, of course, infants and young children whose immune systems are still very immature and developing. The pregnant person themselves is also at a greater risk because their immune system is somewhat compromised, or their body is just doing a lot of work already to, build and produce this fetus. So the immune system is already sort of mildly taxed, if you will. And then certainly as we age too, we've already talked about a little bit in different contexts about how the body really slows down as we age. And so one of those slowdowns is also the immune system. So as we get very old, and especially anybody who's old and potentially hasn't been well anyways already, they would be at a higher risk. Anybody who has a chronic illness, we talked a little bit about how with chronic illness, we see chronic low-grade inflammation, which means the immune system is chronically working or continually working kind of at a low level, but literally all of the time. So in that case, again, the immune system is already taxed. And so then if you ingest this toxic substance or organism, well, your immune system won't be as robust to handle it. Again, anybody who has any sort of immunodeficiency or immunocompromised issues, so anyone who has AIDS is definitely going to be at a higher risk for getting a severe reaction from a foodborne illness. And if anybody's receiving immunosuppressant drugs for any reason, so a lot of times that's part of the cancer treatment is a temporary suppression of the immune system. So if a person receiving cancer therapies, or even somebody who is getting an organ transplant or has recently had an organ transplant, they would be on immunosuppressive drugs. And so again, the immune system is suppressed. So should that person become exposed to a pathogenic microorganism or their toxins, then that person would be at much greater risk for developing severe symptoms related to the foodborne illness. And then sort of some like population level or even public health challenges to addressing foodborne illnesses. So one thing when we kind of look again at the population level, we see increasing numbers of very old and elderly adults, and we see increasing numbers of immunocompromised individuals. So we start to see greater numbers of these people whose immune system may not actually be well equipped at that time to handle a foodborne illness. We also see, when we look at the food system, we also see we have a very global system. So we're getting food from all corners of the world. And what that means is that, well, first of all, the food is going to pass through, various hands, various locations, all sorts of different environments and ecosystems. So there's much more opportunity for exposure to some sort of pathogenic microorganism. But it also means when we're talking about, even just across state lines, but certainly across international lines, we see that food safety regulations and the oversight, sort of the kind of management of those regulations may not be the same in every part of the world. Yeah, and then again, we have a pretty, I guess I would say, elaborate and extensive food system at this point. So, it's no longer quite as simple as just pulling it out of the garden and putting it in the kitchen or putting it on the plate. A lot of times we really are talking about, several different steps of harvesting, processing, packaging, distributing, transporting. So there are numerous, I would say even close to a dozen different, at least different sort of steps in food production these days. And so it's really at any of those stages that contamination can occur. And then just within the United States alone, we also have sort of strong variation, if you will, in our own oversight of food safety. So for better or worse, there are actually 15 different agencies, and your book lists a few of them. There are 15 different agencies that are supposed to oversee food safety regulation. But what that means then is if you have 15 different agencies who are supposed to take care of this pretty important matter, we're again likely to find, and we do find, pretty strong inconsistencies in terms of overseeing the regulations that are supposed to be in place. Certainly there can be breakdowns and inefficiencies in coordination and communication and use of resources. So we see kind of, I guess, all this to say there's a lot of places where things can go wrong. And part of that is just because we have such a massive food system. We have a lot of people that we're trying to feed. And again, we have food coming into this country from literally every corner of the world. So again, it just provides lots of opportunities for contamination. Here's a quick little overview of at least the 5 agencies that were listed on the previous slide. I'm not going to ask you to remember these for our class, but if you're interested, you can just sort of take a look at how, or maybe I'll point it out, but you don't necessarily need to, put any of this in your memory. But so we have the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the USDA, and then the Food Safety and Inspection Service. And you can see what they regulate. So those two regulate a lot of meat, poultry, and egg safety, right, as well as labeling. The Food and Drug Administration regulates standards of food products and bottled water, except for meat, poultry, and eggs. So the FDA sort of does all other food products. They also regulate food labeling and enforce pesticide use. And pesticide use is first established by the Environmental Protection Agency. And then the Centers for Disease Control, they're sort of the public health branch. So their duty is more around education to the public, right? And then the Environmental Protection Agency, they do regulate the use of pesticides on farms, as well as which crops can get pesticides. And then they also establish water quality standards. So you can see, I mean, in a way, maybe it makes sense to sort of break up the different duties, but then you can start to see, okay, well, if one branch is overseeing meat, poultry, and egg safety, and then another branch is overseeing the safety everywhere else, and then, the EPA regulates the pesticide use, but the FDA is supposed to actually oversee that and enforce it. And then you have the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and they're supposed to be out there educating, right, and teaching the public about these food safety protocols and whatnot. But yet the CDC doesn't, in fact, oversee or do any of the regulation themselves. So you start to see how fragmented it can be, at least a little bit. And again, the point in saying all this is that it's very easy for contamination to occur and actually go unnoticed. I mean, we'll notice it eventually, but you've probably haven't. Hopefully, you've noticed just even in the last handful of years, there's almost always different food-related outbreaks, right? And foods being recalled because they were contaminated with something. I think we're continually improving in our, food safety management, but certainly with such a large system, it probably won't be perfect. This table from your book, or figure 15.1, just sort of gives you an example. This would be for meat processing and packaging. This sort of shows you 5 steps of the, food production pathway. And honestly, sometimes it isn't really even just this straightforward. But you have, on the farm itself, certainly that's where some contamination can occur. But then you also have at the slaughterhouse and the processing facility where they butcher the animals and, start to put together different cuts of meat, if you will. That is certainly a place where a lot of contamination can occur, and a lot of, processing facility workers are often kind of the first to get exposed to contamination that might come through meat, because they're handling oftentimes close to 100,000 dead animals a day. And then at transportation, so now you're transporting all of these, sometimes the carcasses, maybe they are slaughtered in one place and then processed elsewhere, but oftentimes a slaughterhouse and a processing facility would go together or be the same location. But transportation, then you're transporting these different cuts of the meat, and so it does need to be refrigerated transportation, or else you would easily see microorganisms proliferating. And then retail, so again, at the grocery store, basically, or at the butcher shop. Again, this is another place where contamination can occur, because you want to keep especially if it's meat, you want to keep it very cold so that microorganisms can't grow. And then also at home, or maybe it's at a restaurant, right? So how we prepare the meat once we're ready to eat it. Oftentimes we have to cook it to a high enough temperature to make sure that if there were any organisms still living in the flesh of these animals, that we kill off those microorganisms before ingesting it ourselves. So now let's talk about these microorganisms a bit. Let's talk about what is actually causing foodborne illness. So 2 further terms to sort of delineate here. We have food infection. So food infection is the infection that's caused by consuming the food that contains the pathogenic microorganism. Food intoxication is caused by consuming microorganisms that have secreted toxins. So the infection comes from a pathogenic microorganism itself, and then intoxication comes from specific toxins being secreted by the organism. So 2 of the leading viruses that cause food-related illnesses, we have the norovirus and hepatitis A virus. And I'll say a little more about each of these on the next page. And then bacteria, certainly we probably see a greater number, we do see a greater number of bacteria causing food-related illnesses than we do viruses. The bacteria primarily come from consuming raw or undercooked food, typically meat, and then if it's a vegetable, it's usually a vegetable that was contaminated by raw or undercooked meat. Or sometimes it's vegetable that was contaminated by human or animal feces on the field, so at the site of the farm, and then wasn't necessarily processed or handled well enough to kill off the microorganisms prior to providing it for human consumption. And then we'll talk about plant toxins. We will also talk a little bit about chemical residues for the end of the lecture, and we'll talk about parasites and fungi. So viruses and bacteria are the two most common microorganisms that cause food infections. Again, norovirus and HAV are the two most common viruses. Norovirus is very much the most common, and it is actually the most common cause of all food-related illnesses in the United States. It's accountable for about half of all the cases we see. So norovirus is what causes the stomach flu. We call it flu, but it is not actually related to the influenza virus. So just an important note. But it's basically like gastroenteritis, so inflammation of the stomach is sort of the major symptom of norovirus. So that's why we kind of call it the stomach flu, because it's really the stomach that gets affected the most. And then HAV, so this is inflammation of the liver. So you would even see jaundice in severe cases, sort of that yellowing of the skin, and also potential for death. Then of bacteria, the most common bacterial infection comes from salmonella. And so salmonella is second to norovirus in terms of causing all food-borne illnesses. Salmonella definitely causes the most hospitalizations and also the most deaths. So it's a little more, can be a bit more severe than norovirus or the stomach flu. Earlier symptoms would include fever, diarrhea, abdominal cramps, and then if it does invade the blood, that's when it can become fatal. So viruses, as maybe we're becoming increasingly familiar with, viruses have to live, they can only live inside of like a host organism. So viruses are often spread sort of person to person. Some viruses, including norovirus, can actually live on surfaces for an extended period of time. And norovirus is unique because it can live on dry surfaces, actually. So that's why norovirus is one of the most common, or the most common food-related illness, because it can spread very easily from one person to the other. Whereas bacteria, they don't necessarily require a living host. So they can sort of, as we talked about a little bit on the previous slide, bacteria often live in soil, and so on an animal on the farm and even crops on the farm, they're often going to be sort of side by side with many different types of bacteria. And so one of the most common ways that we see bacterial contamination of food is exposure to human or animal feces, which again, especially with animal feces, that's not uncommon. That's a common crop fertilizer, right? To help sort of make the soil actually nutrient rich. But if it's not well incorporated, or if the plants aren't, if it's not well incorporated into the soil, if it potentially gets onto the leaves or the other like edible portions of the plant, that's when it becomes a contaminant. And if it's not properly washed off or cleaned, then it can be, that's where it can become dangerous. So bacteria can sort of be existing in the food, whereas the viruses are sort of spread person to person. Here's sort of a micrographic look at norovirus and a micrographic look at salmonella. And then I think this is a two-part chart. So this goes over the 5 leading bacteria that cause, or the 5 most common bacteria to cause foodborne illnesses and death. So you have Campylobacter, Clostridium perfringens, and Listeria monocytogenes. You don't really need to remember these, but it sort of shows you kind of their incubation period, so how long it might take from exposure to the bacteria to actually seeing symptoms, then the duration of the symptoms, and you can see quite a range, right? Like with Clostridium perfringens, it's just about a 24-hour flu, or sorry, a 24-hour illness, whereas with Listeria monocytogenes, it could be even a week or several weeks. What you'll notice is that with bacteria, the most commonly affected foods, again, are raw and undercooked meats, poultry, eggs, unpasteurized milk. So you'll see that is pretty common, and especially, especially raw and undercooked meats. Where we see fruits and vegetables listed, again, it's usually going to be either from that human or animal feces from the field or a cross-contamination, even like in the kitchen. So if you're home and you are cooking with raw meats and eggs, it's really important to keep the raw meat and eggs separate from anything else that you might cook, and then also thoroughly clean the kitchen, even the sink, even the cutting boards and knives, to try to avoid that cross-contamination. Before cooking your other foods, I mean to say before cooking the fruits and vegetables. Because again, if we go back to, all the way back, if we go back here, your own home kitchen can be one of the sites of contamination. And then the second page to the chart, so again, Salmonella, and then Staphylococcus aureus. So Staph aureus is one of the ones that does produce an enterotoxin. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Again, you'll see the same sort of thing. So raw or undercooked meat, poultry, and eggs, unpasteurized milks. So we'll talk a lot about, well, not a lot, but we'll talk in more detail about practicing proper cleaning, sanitizing, and washing. Again, even at home and kind of in between cooking with raw and undercooked meats and eggs, and then cleaning thoroughly before getting to your fruits and vegetables and other components of the meal. Here are the references for the chart. Okay, so that's sort of as much as we're going to say about viruses and bacteria. So now let's talk about some of the other microorganisms that can also be causing food-related infections. So we have parasites, and I think a lot of people are kind of familiar with the definition of parasites. These are microorganisms that sort of live in a host and often benefit from the host while causing harm to the host, right? So two examples on this slide, we have helminths, which are sort of like worms. So you might be familiar with tapeworms and roundworms. Flukes would be another example. And then we also have protozoa. So with helminths or with worms, what often happens is that the worms will lay their eggs in vegetation. So again, sort of out in the field. And then if it's, cows or chickens or pigs or whatever it might be, they might consume the vegetation, and then those eggs will hatch inside the animal. So that's sort of how parasites work, or how the helminths work, is that they kind of want their eggs to get inside of a host animal, and then the eggs will hatch, and then the new worms can kind of grow inside of that animal. So again, that's where, again, we as humans become exposed to worms, again, oftentimes by eating raw and undercooked meat and fish that have been contaminated with these worms. And then protozoa. So again, often we would be infected by eating undercooked, contaminated meat, and eating produce like fruits and vegetables that might have been contaminated by contaminated meat. Two examples are Toxoplasma gondii and Giardia. I don't know if I put more, I guess I thought I had a little more about Giardia, but I think if people are somewhat familiar with Giardia, right, you can actually be exposed to that even through contaminated water. Two other types of parasites, fungi and prions. So fungi are like yeasts, molds, and commonly well-known mushrooms. So not all yeasts, molds, and mushrooms are harmful, but of course some are. What's interesting, I think, about the fungi is that they actually cause very few serious food-related infections. And most of that is because their growth is very visible on the food. So we can see that the food is affected or inflicted with a fungi, so we know not to eat it, right? So that's why yeasts and molds and mushrooms don't often cause serious problems, because we don't often ingest the fungi because we can see it. Whereas with viruses, bacteria, helminths, and protozoa, typically we can't see those, so we eat it unknowingly. And then prions are these really interesting, like, protein particles that misfold and then start to infect other cells and other proteins. So they kind of cause this cascade effect of misshapen proteins that, as you might remember, if a protein is misshapen, it doesn't do its job correctly. So what we typically see from infection with prions is like progressive, especially neurological disease, and ultimately death. Perhaps the most common one we know is bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or BSE. And so this affects cows. It's more commonly called mad cow disease. And so if a human eats a cow that is affected with bovine spongiform encephalopathy, then the human will actually develop this progressive neurological disease. And in humans, we call it Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. So it's sort of the variant that exists in humans. Here is a microscopic look at a tapeworm. And then a look at mold, not microscopic, right? Because these would be full-size strawberries. And so again, we can often see it. They make the food actually visually unappetizing, so we know, oh, I'm not going to eat that. I'm just going to, throw it out. And then we can talk a little bit about some of the organisms that secrete toxins. So bacteria and fungi can secrete toxins. We'll also take a look at least one example of a plant and algae that can secrete toxins. So similar to like the microorganism itself causing the problem, in this case, it's the toxins that cause the foodborne illness. So we can categorize toxins in two ways. We categorize them by the type of cell, or basically the organ within the body that gets most affected, or organ system. So most commonly we have neurotoxins and enterotoxins. Neurotoxins affect the brain, and enterotoxins affect the gastrointestinal system. Again, just kind of look at the first part of those words: neuro, meaning neurological or the brain; entero, speaking of the gastrointestinal system, so the stomach and the rest of the GI tract. So the common symptom of neurotoxins is paralysis, and the common symptoms of enterotoxins would be severe diarrhea and vomiting. So a few different types of bacteria that secrete toxins that are, relatively common in our food supply. So Clostridium botulinum, and you might be familiar with the disorder called botulism. So Clostridium botulinum is a bacteria that produces this neurotoxin, or produces a neurotoxin. So that means it affects the brain, the neurological system. And we find Clostridium botulinum and its neurotoxin in actually most commonly in canned foods that were improperly canned. So one of the more obvious signs, if you're looking at canned food, if you see a bulging can, you might guess, okay, that may be infected with Clostridium botulinum, so I'm not going to eat what's in there. Then we also have something called Staph aureus. So Staph aureus produces the most common foodborne enterotoxin, so again, affecting the GI tract. Again, a major symptom would be vomiting. Again, your body trying to expel or get rid of that harmful toxin. And then you might also have heard of E. coli and different outbreaks of E. coli contamination. So there are actually many different strains of E. coli, some of which are actually pretty benign and not harmful to us. But one of the more, I guess, infectious strains is E. coli 0157H7. And so this strain of E. coli produces something called Shiga toxin. And Shiga toxin is a toxin to the body, more of an enterotoxin. So it can affect your digestive organs, and it can even be deadly. So sometimes, as I said, there are some benign strains of E. coli. So sometimes the ones that are potentially infectious and producing Shiga toxin are called Shiga toxin producing E. coli, especially instead of using this full sort of scientific name, E. coli 0157H7. And then we have fungi, right? So we have different fungi that can produce toxins. So rather than like yeasts and molds that you might see growing on a food, and the yeast and the mold being the pathogenic thing itself, we have some mushrooms that actually produce different toxins that if we ingest the toxins, that's what's poisonous and infectious to us. So the toxins produced by fungi, we call them mycotoxins. And one of the common places we see this is can actually develop in grain storage, right? So when we go out and we harvest, millions of acres of wheat, and then it's stored in some silo for an extended period of time until it sort of like goes into the next stage of processing and production to be packaged for human consumption. It has to be really well stored and I guess taken care of in storage. So if the environment in which the grain is being stored is too humid, then that sort of creates a perfect environment for these fungi to grow and potentially produce these harmful mycotoxins. And then we have some mushrooms like the death cap mushroom, which again, if we were to go out and sort of forage mushrooms and maybe pick the wrong ones, well, the death cap mushroom has its name because it produces a poisonous toxin. So if we ingest the death cap mushroom, typically a side effect would be death. Here's another mushroom, the fly agaric mushroom. So again, also produces a toxin. So if we ingest this, we could get sick and potentially could be fatal. Then we have certain marine organisms that do secrete toxins. So one of the most common examples here is toxic algae. And even in the Finger Lakes, hopefully you've noticed in recent years, this is increasingly common too. So not all algae are toxic, and in fact, humans and other animals eat a lot of algae, but of course, some are toxic. So what you might have heard this term, harmful algal bloom, which basically means when these toxic algae become overproductive in a certain area or certain body of water. So typically this occurs with really warm temperatures, sort of excessively warm temperatures, such that these algae can overproduce. So hopefully maybe you've noticed in some of the Finger Lakes in recent years, sections of the lake, or even sometimes, I don't know if a whole lake has ever been closed down, but a section of the lake might be off limits to swimmers or even to boaters because there's an overgrowth of the toxic algae. Along ocean coastlines, there have been things called red tides, where, and they're called red tides because the water literally turns sort of a reddish pink or blue color, again, due to overproduction of these toxic algae in the seawater. Again, the blooms will die down too once the environment isn't quite so hospitable for them. But one of the reasons that, again, the water will be closed off to humans is because if we ingest the algae by swimming in the water, oftentimes if you're swimming, you might swallow little bits of water, and so we can become infected that way. But as I said too, like oftentimes boaters and fishers would not be allowed in those waters too, because if we ingest fish that we're feeding on the algae, then we can become sick by ingesting basically the toxins through the fish. Also, oftentimes you'll notice even the shoreline might get blocked off because we can actually breathe in these toxins. If the algae are prolific enough, we can actually ingest the toxins through breathing. So a lot of times the water will be closed off to swimming and to boating, and even a pretty broad section of the shoreline would be closed off too. And then lastly, we can talk about some plants that, well, we'll talk about one plant that secretes toxin. So humans have been around for a long time, right? We've started to become quite familiar with different plants that are toxic. So we've evolved to identify and avoid most toxic plants. There's a really interesting one, which is the potato, which is still obviously a very common food, certainly in the United States and other parts of the world. So potatoes have the potential to produce a toxin called solanine, but they're not just out there always producing solanine. Potatoes will start to produce solanine during the greening process. So this is a process that happens only when potatoes are exposed to light. So if you keep potatoes in the house, right, maybe you've heard that you should keep the potatoes in a cool, dark place, right? So either putting them in a paper bag and keeping them in a cool part of the pantry, or like a root cellar, or keeping them in the refrigerator even. You can do a little experiment if you want to and take a potato and leave it out on the countertop or in a sunny window and like let it be exposed to the light. And you'll notice eventually parts of the skin will turn green. And at that point, you don't want to eat it. I'm saying only do this experiment just to sort of see, but then you need to throw that potato away, because as it starts to literally turn green on its skin, it is producing solanine, and solanine can be quite toxic. So symptoms, if a person accidentally ingested a green potato, symptoms again would be vomiting, diarrhea, fever, headache, and depending on the amount of toxic solanine ingested, there could be eventually shock and even death. So, it's a regular old potato, but under certain circumstances, it can produce this pretty intense toxin. So really important to check potatoes. Also, always make sure to wash your potatoes. I mean, at the grocery store, potatoes are pretty well washed, but always make sure to wash your potatoes so that you can see if there's any greening that has started. If it is green, throw it away. And then again, if you don't already, just sort of maybe shift the way you store your potatoes. Again, should be a dark, cool place, like a cupboard or a paper bag, and only for a short period of time, right? So typically only a few weeks. Again, if you have potatoes around for longer than that, check them to make sure they haven't started to turn green. And if they have turned green, throw them away. So we'll say a little bit here about some of the environmental conditions. I've already alluded to this a little bit, but some of the environmental conditions that microorganisms love. So conditions in which we're going to see microorganisms living and even thriving. So I've mentioned sort of humidity, right? Like even just right here, we said, I didn't say dry, I guess, a dark, cool place. So maybe I haven't mentioned humidity too much, but I've definitely mentioned temperature, right? And it's usually kind of warm to even hot temperatures that microorganisms thrive in. So there's something called the danger zone in temperature, which is about 40 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit or 4 to 60 degrees Celsius. So again, warm to even hot temperatures where toxic microorganisms, most of them, love to exist. So they'll replicate really quickly, really easily in this temperature. So that's why we say things like store in a cool, dark place. Humidity, though, we talked on the grains page, well, not the grains page, but when we talked about grains, right, with these fungal toxins, we said that on certain grains or on grains in certain environmental conditions, these fungi can grow and reproduce and replicate and produce more mycotoxin. And so one of the environmental conditions that allows the fungal growth is if it's too moist, right? If the grain silo isn't well aerated. So moisture, most microorganisms really like a moist environment. So they like it to be humid. Also, many microorganisms prefer a slightly acidic environment as well. So not very acidic, but slightly acidic. And then most of them are also aerobic, so they need oxygen to survive. So that's why you'll see a lot of food that has been preserved is preserved by removing the oxygen. So again, just a quick look at the quote danger zone. So the temperatures in which microorganisms thrive, it's in that 40 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. This is showing you where room temperature is, right? So room temperature is right in the middle of the danger zone. So what this is saying is that raw and cooked foods should not be left out, because obviously raw foods should not be left out because the microorganisms might already exist in the raw food. But even cooked food can become, right? It would be a moist environment. So cooked food can even become, and it would be a warm environment. Cooked food can also become an environment in which microorganisms can grow and reproduce. So once we cook a food, that's why it's always important to put it in the refrigerator once you're done eating it, because the refrigerator is generally below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. There's also this concept of keeping hot foods hot, right? Like if you're, I guess if you're kind of hosting a dinner and you want to keep food out for people to, eat over an extended period of time, if it's a hot food, you want to keep it hot. So keep it above 140 degrees Fahrenheit while you're serving it. Otherwise, if it starts to cool off at all, then you're back in the danger zone and the microorganisms could be reproducing. So I mentioned a couple of these already, but just kind of giving you a nice overview of things you can do to prevent your exposure to foodborne illness, or at least significantly reduce. So things you can do at home. So again, wash your hands before beginning to prepare food, because you could be the reason that the food gets contaminated. There might be some sort of microorganism on your hands, and if it were to get in the food and replicate, then it can become dangerous. Also, wash off kitchen surfaces before beginning to prep, especially if you have animals in the house, especially if you have indoor-outdoor animals. Again, they don't necessarily need to be animals that get on the countertops, but even, if they go outside, they might bring some bacteria back inside, and you could have sort of cross-contaminated, or you could have picked up some of those microorganisms, and they could make their way to your kitchen. So always good to just even do a quick cleaning of your kitchen surfaces before starting to prepare food. Again, separate your food. So this is particularly around raw meats, eggs, Yeah, raw meats and eggs and fish. So if you're going to cook with raw meats and eggs and fish, do those first and then clean thoroughly. Or they don't have to do it first, but do it separately from your fruits and vegetables, and make sure to do a thorough cleaning before and after the raw meat or fish or eggs. Again, cool foods back down to below 40 degrees Fahrenheit once you're done eating and serving it. And then with, I have another image to show you, but when you're cooking with meat in particular, you need to cook different types of meats to a specific temperature. And at that point, you can sort of safely assume that you've killed off any potential bacteria. You'll notice the temperatures will all be above 140. Right, and then this concept of keeping hot foods hot and cold foods cold. So again, as I kind of showed you on this page, if you're going to be serving food for an extended period of time, hot food, make sure to keep it above 140 degrees Fahrenheit. If you're going to be serving cold foods like different salads or coleslaws or that sort of thing, or an egg salad, for example, you want to make sure that you're actually keeping it cold, like below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, to ensure that all of the food you're serving is outside of that danger zone temperature. And then I say down here, just be aware when you're eating out. Just, yeah, be aware. I mean, I know a lot of times people might order kind of raw or very lightly cooked meat. And, you know, just know that that's your choice. You don't necessarily know how well cared for or how clean everything was in the back in the kitchen in that particular establishment, but if you feel good about it, you know, go for it. But also, you know, monitor yourself for potential symptoms afterwards too. Yeah, just a quick little pictorial overview of all those things. Clean your surfaces, separate raw meats and fish and eggs. Again, cook to appropriate temperatures and keep hot foods hot and cold foods cold. For anybody cooking meat, this is a helpful chart. Oh, no, sorry, this isn't the one. This is actually just showing you, this is also helpful, but not the one I was thinking. This is actually just showing you how many days you can keep different types of, I think this is all, yeah, meat, poultry, eggs, and fish. But you'll notice really the only thing that keeps for a long time is eggs. Otherwise, everything is a matter of days. Luncheon meats, those can keep a longer period of time. You might recall, though, when we talked about healthy eating, these are actually foods that are recommended to reduce or actually even avoid. So if cooking with fresh or potentially even frozen, but once you bring it into the refrigerator, any sort of raw meats, you're only looking at a few days that you can keep it raw and uncooked before you should cook it and eat it. Here is the figure, sorry, the one showing you the safe cooking temperatures. So again, you'll notice, and this is only for meat, because again, with fruits and vegetables, if there is contamination, actually, honestly, just by washing the produce thoroughly, you significantly reduce the risk for exposure. Most often, these pathogenic microorganisms aren't actually living in the fruits or the vegetables, but they can live in the flesh of these dead animals. So, and also the living animal before it's slaughtered. So the cooking is really specific to meat, fish, poultry, and eggs. We don't have to cook fruits and vegetables to a certain temperature. Really, the key there is to just wash them thoroughly before ingesting them. So you'll notice all these temperatures are above 140 degrees. With beef, pork, veal, lamb steaks, roast, and chops, it's 140 degrees for 3-minute rest time before serving. Fish is 145. Ground beef, because this can be perhaps one of the most common opportunities for food contamination with beef or with cattle. And again, part of that is just the extent to which these animals are processed and the opportunity for cross-contamination, honestly, just in the packaging facilities. Egg dishes, heat those up to 160 degrees, and then poultry, 165. And so then I said a little bit about this so far, but this is just showing us that even in cooked food, we can still have the potential for bacterial development. So the title says food contamination is possible long after the microorganism is gone. So the example here is Staph aureus, and you might remember Staph aureus is one of these ones that has a toxin, that produces a toxin. And bacterial toxins are really kind of tricky because they can survive like environmental conditions that the microorganism itself couldn't. So in this first schematic, right, you're cooking the food that was contaminated with Staph aureus. Cooked food is contaminated. Oh, okay, sorry. This is saying cooked food gets contaminated by Staph aureus by the hand of the person serving it. Then the food gets left out. Okay, so I'm sorry, I thought this was saying something else. Right, this is saying that even once you cook the food, it can still get contaminated later on. And as I said earlier, this is why hand washing is so important, because unfortunately, you or I, we can be the reason that food gets contaminated because we continually walk around with bacteria on our hands. That's just part of nature. But prior to touching food and serving food, really goes a long way to just wash your hands real quickly for 20 seconds. Okay, so somebody's hand contaminates this cooked, let's call it like a casserole, right? And then the food gets left out. Probably, it sounds like, probably gets left out in the danger zone, right? Doesn't look like it was refrigerated. Doesn't look like it was being kept at over 140 degrees Fahrenheit. So then what happens is Staph aureus has now affected or infected this food. The Staph aureus came from the hands. So now this food is in the danger zone temperature range. So Staph aureus says, ooh, this is perfect condition. It's moist, it's warm, I've got oxygen exposure, I can replicate. So Staph aureus replicates. Then maybe the food was refrigerated, maybe not, but at some point later, the food got reheated. And so let's even assume that it did get reheated to above 140 degrees Fahrenheit. But as I kind of mentioned up here, the toxin itself is a lot more robust, I guess, than the bacteria. So the Staph aureus replicated and started producing its toxin. And so once we reheated the food, let's assume we reheated it to above 140 degrees Fahrenheit. So the Staph aureus died off, but all the toxin that it was producing didn't die off. So then we eat the reheated food. We're not ingesting Staph aureus at this point, but we're ingesting its toxin. So then, about 5 hours later, we start to feel the effect of the food poisoning or the food intoxication from the Staph aureus toxin. So all of this is to say, no matter when you're preparing food, even if you're just reheating something, make sure to take proper precaution. And I guess even before you reheat food, once you've cooked something for the first time, really make sure to take care of the food after you've cooked it, because even after you've cooked it, you can see contamination. So make sure to put it in the refrigerator or keep it hot above 140. So a little bit about other things that can be done to, or let me say, I guess here we're going to talk about food preservation techniques. And so food preservation is done as a means of trying to change the environment of the food so that the pathogenic organisms cannot survive. So traditional common methods for food preservation include salting, right? Sugaring, drying, smoking, and then of course cooling. So in any of these methods, adding salt, adding sugar, drying it, smoking it, we're removing moisture and or oxygen, or we're potentially changing the pH so that we're trying to make the environment inhospitable for these potentially pathogenic microorganisms. And then at the sort of industrial level, these are some food preservation techniques that might be used. So canning, pasteurization, aseptic packaging, modified atmospheric packaging, high pressure processing, and irradiation. So again, in all of these cases, we're going to see the same things, just sort of through different processes. But again, the end goal is to remove moisture and or oxygen, to reduce the pH, and potentially in many of these also to remove the oxygen. So those 4 key things that the microorganisms love or need even to survive, that's what we're trying to do in food preservation, is reduce or change the environment such that these microorganisms can no longer survive. So canning, just like you might do home canning, obviously industrial canning would be a little bit more of a mechanized, large-scale process. But oftentimes, because you've removed oxygen, you're also removing exposure to light. Oftentimes, well, temperature, I guess, would probably stay the same, but the primary thing you're removing with canning is the oxygen. So oftentimes, food that is canned has a shelf life of a pretty good long shelf life, like 2 years. Pasteurization is taking the food to a really high temperature to try to kill the microorganism. So obviously milk is pasteurized. A lot of beverages are pasteurized. Some juices are even pasteurized. So common pasteurization technique requires taking the food to a temperature of 162 degrees Fahrenheit, keeping it there for at least 15 seconds. And that should be actually enough time to kill off any of the potentially pathogenic microorganisms that might be living in that liquid food. Aseptic packaging is another technique that is commonly used for like little juice boxes. This should say shelf life is usually about 6 months with aseptic packaging. So again, it's sort of a heating process to try to kill off any microorganisms, also using sterile containers. So this sometimes used in place of canning. Modified atmospheric packaging, so again, removing the oxygen. High pressure cooking, so again, taking the food to a very high temperature, high pressure, which will often increase the temperature too, but that again will inactivate most bacteria. And then a technique called irradiation that can also kill off bacteria. So an interesting issue though with food preservation is that many nutrients actually get lost in these various preservation methods. So obviously at some point in human history, food preservation was very necessary because we didn't have such a, I guess, robust food supply where we are growing fresh food all year long and able to ship it all across the globe. So food preservation is maybe less essential now than it was even just 75 or 100 years ago. So just because we've preserved food doesn't mean it's totally devoid of nutritional value, but generally it is less nutritious than eating the fresh alternative. The one thing that also isn't in here is just freezing. And actually freezing is really interesting because it has the highest potential to preserve the nutritive value of the food relative to these other preservation techniques. Irradiating our food is somewhat controversial. So the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, does require this symbol to be put on any food that has been irradiated, so that any consumers who are aware of what the symbol might be indicating can choose if they want to ingest an irradiated food or not. Other food preservation techniques, so adding nutrients and adding other preservatives. What's really interesting is that a lot of the nutrients, at least vitamins C and E, that we talked about as being antioxidants, can also be used as preservatives, in part because they reduce the potential for oxidation, because oxidation is quite literally a sort of a spoiling process. Remember the example I gave of biting into an apple and leaving it out on the countertop, and eventually the flesh would turn brown. That's literally oxidation. So high amounts, obviously apples also have vitamin C, but not necessarily enough to self-preserve. So really high amounts of vitamin C or vitamin E, or even vitamin D and folate, can sometimes be used as preservatives. Other preservatives that are pretty common are sulfites and nitrates. Sulfites are common in wine, and a lot of people are actually just plain sensitive to sulfites. So if they ingest sulfites, they'll get some mild to severe symptoms, like potentially asthma, asthmatic symptoms. Often headaches are a really common symptom from ingesting sulfites. So the sulfites have to be indicated on the ingredients list if they are used. So that way people who are sensitive to sulfites can, again, sort of make the choice to ingest the food or not. And then nitrates are interesting. These are really common in meat preservation. So a lot of processed meats then need to be preserved in their processing. So a lot of salamis, a lot of deli meats. Yeah, I guess I don't know how else to say salamis, like cured meats, often use nitrates in the curing process or in the preservation process. So these are of concern because when we humans ingest nitrates, our bodies convert them into something called nitrosamine, the nitrosamines get, nitrates can get converted into nitrosamines during a cooking process. So if you're cooking, like hot dogs are another common place where you would see nitrates. Often bacon is a place where you would see nitrates. So once you cook then the bacon or the hot dog, in the cooking process, the nitrate gets converted into something called nitrosamine, and then you eat the cooked hot dog or you eat the cooked bacon, and so you ingest these nitrosamines, and in our body, the nitrosamines can then be carcinogenic, so cancer-causing. This is why on the Harvard Healthy Eating Plate, again, if you kind of go back to Unit 1, or just Google Harvard Healthy Eating Plate and take a look at their protein food section, you'll see that it says to avoid intake of processed meats. This is one of the primary reasons for avoiding processed meat consumption, is because we know that they are potentially carcinogenic. Also, I think I mentioned briefly that the World Health Organization has deemed processed meats a known human carcinogen, and it's because of this. So again, it's sort of a choose at your own volition if you want to eat large amounts of processed meats or any at all. What's really interesting, I think, is that if you do make the choice to knowingly ingest nitrosamines, worth also ingesting it with a food rich in vitamin C, because vitamin C can kind of counteract the nitrosamines in your body. Other food additives. So I think kind of interestingly, we don't go into great detail about these in this course, but these are sort of 6 categories of food additives. And food additives are very, very common. Some are totally benign, others are not necessarily. But we have things that are added into our food to enhance the flavor. Monosodium glutamate, or MSG, is maybe one of the most commonly known. We have food colorants, some of which are naturally occurring, like beet juice, others which are completely synthetic or artificial, and some are indicated in also potentially being carcinogenic. We add some things to our food to enhance the texture. We talked briefly in the lipids lecture about when fat gets removed from a food, the texture of the food changes. So a lot of times actually different types of fibers might be added into the food to sort of help replace that like sort of thickness that fat often provides, that sort of thick texture. Emulsifiers, so you might remember this, a version of this word also when we talked about fat digestion. We said that bile emulsifies fat in the small intestine, so makes it available for further digestion. So emulsification is this process of sort of combining oily substances or lipid-based substances with water-based substances. Sometimes you'll see this in salad dressings, so that the oil and the vinegar can actually mix and hold together so that the salad dressing doesn't separate. Sometimes you'll see that in peanut butter too, so that the oil doesn't totally separate from the peanut butter. Humectants, things to actually keep the environment moist. So a lot of like, pre-made breads or a lot of those sort of bakery type products. You don't want to bite into like a super dried out bread. So if it's sort of a shelf stable bread, a lot of something that can exist in your pantry for weeks at a time, oftentimes there are humectants added in there to keep it moist all the time. Whereas if you buy like a nice loaf of bread from a bakery, very fresh, say you have it at home for a few days, probably by about day 4, it's kind of like rock solid. You can't really eat it anymore. That's because it's a fresh loaf of bread that didn't have preservatives added to it, or additives, I should say. So it didn't have humectants added, so it dried out naturally in just a matter of days. And then the opposite of humectants, desiccants, so things to try to keep foods dry. What would be an example? Like sometimes different rice mixes or different, sometimes you'll see like dried beans maybe already mixed together with some spices, so you can just put it all in a crock pot and have soup at the end of the day. Sometimes there would be a desiccant added in there to keep everything in the bag dry until the time you want to cook it. Sometimes you'll also see this in like crackers, like sometimes it's that little desiccant baggie, but sometimes it's also actually incorporated into the food. So I think maybe there's just 2 slides here, but this is kind of neat. I think it goes through these different types of food additives that we just mentioned and gives you examples of each. So colorants and beet extract and beta carotene are 2 naturally occurring ones, right? So that's kind of cool. I guess they didn't put red 40 in here. So they left out some of the more, like you'll notice all the different colors, like literally red number 40, you'll see like blue lake 10. These are really common in boxed cereals and a lot of drinks. And I'll put again in this week's content the link to the Center for Science in the Public Interest and their website Chemical Cuisine, because again, that's a great place to go to look up any of these different food additives and get a very honest scientific perspective as to whether or not these food additives are safe to consume long term. Different preservatives, so things to keep the food from spoiling. Again, alpha tocopherol is vitamin E, ascorbic acid is vitamin C, so sometimes you'll see it written as alpha tocopherol or ascorbic acid in the ingredients list. EDTA is a kind of a controversial one. Calcium propionate and sodium propionate, those are pretty common too, relatively benign. Other preservatives, so again, sulfites, like we said, and again, this is one to look out for because a lot of people are kind of mildly allergic to it. What else is common? Sodium chloride, right? So basic salt. Sodium nitrite, you might see potassium sorbate. And then these, just a few examples of texturizers, emulsifiers, and stabilizers. So texturizers, here's a list of all of these different fibers that you might see. So again, you'll see them added to things like added to things where you want sort of this nice, sort of rich, thick texture. That's what any of these cellulose, guar gum, gum arabic, locust gum, and xanthan gum, they're all going to be added to something to sort of give it that nice thick texture. So a sour cream, maybe a ricotta cheese, ice cream for sure, a lot of syrups, a lot of sauces, soups even to give it a thick broth. Let's see, lecithin is a very common emulsifier. So again, like mayonnaise, a place, and salad dressing, again, it doesn't, yeah, I'm surprised they didn't list salad dressing, but a place where you want to hold sort of water-based ingredients with fat-based ingredients or lipid-based ingredients. Carrageenan also, interestingly, is derived from seaweed. And then pectin is a fiber from our fruits. So again, these often are adding some texture to, pectin is one of our fibers, if I didn't just say that. So adding some texture again to different foods. And then humectants. So I don't think we get an example of a desiccant, but humectants, again, trying to keep the food moist. So chewing gum, actually. And you might see glycerin, and then propylene glycol is another one. So again, some of these are relatively benign, some of them are not. And that's why, again, I really like the Center for Science in the Public Interest, their chemical cuisine website, because you can go read some of the latest science about these and you can make the choice yourself. Then just a little history of allowing food additives into our food system in the United States. So back in 1958, there was something called the Delaney Clause, which said that no additive could be added to a food in any amount if tests were to show that that additive produces cancer when fed to humans or animals through appropriate testing. Also in that same year, though, a law was passed called the GRAS law, so the generally recognized as safe law. And it was a list, it provided a list of food additives that were exempt from testing because there was some scientific consensus that this additive was safe and could be used long term without potential for harm. There's a lot of controversy around the generally recognized as safe list, but it is still very much a part of our food processing regulation and oversight, even here in 2021. About 30 years later, in 1985, we had something called the Adverse Reaction Monitoring System that came about. And this was put in place so that the FDA would actually have to begin to investigate complaints coming from consumers or physicians or even food companies about potential adverse effects caused by food additives. In 2015, so relatively recently, we had maybe one of the, I don't know, maybe one of the more well-known, not really a revision to, but I guess, what do I want to say? Conflicts maybe with the generally recognized as safe list. So it took a while, but by 2015, trans fats, which used to be part of the GRAS list, generally recognized as safe, was finally removed from the GRAS list because we finally had so much evidence that this was actually a really damaging substance to have in our food supply. And this is part of, if you remember in our lipids conversation, partially hydrogenated oils are trans fats. Remember that process of hydrogenation, sort of forcing hydrogens to bond with a cis-shaped double bond in a fatty acid chain. Forcing that hydrogenation changes the orientation of the double bond from cis, meaning same, to trans, meaning opposite. And so when we do that hydrogenation to oils or to lipids, we create trans fats, and we know that trans fats are a major health risk in the diet. So slowly, we're starting to remove partially hydrogenated oils and trans fats from our food supply, and trans fats were removed from this list of generally recognized as safe additives. So back in the beginning, when I mentioned like food, when we were talking about sources of food-related illnesses, one of the things I mentioned was chemical residues. And so we haven't talked about that yet, but this will be the section in which we talk about chemical residues. But to sort of give a broad overview or introduction to talk about chemical residues, we'll start here with genetic modification. So this is sort of, this whole conversation, I guess we could call like food science, right? And food technologies. So different technologies that are being applied to how we grow plants and even how we grow animals for human consumption for our food supply. So genetic modification kind of gets lumped into this term called genetic engineering. So genetic modification is basically where the DNA of an organism changes. Right? It's literally sort of a change to the DNA. And humans have been doing a form of gene modification for actually, arguably, since humans started systems of agriculture. And one of the ways that we've been genetically modifying our plants and animals for human consumption is through things like selective breeding. So crossbreeding two animals because maybe they have, one animal is really sort of robust, has a really healthy immune system, and whatever, it can sort of tolerate many different climates or diseases. And then another animal maybe is just a large animal, produces a lot of muscle tissue, which translates to a lot of meat. So by crossbreeding those two animals, you sort of get the best of both worlds. You get great disease resistance, great environmental tolerance, and you get these big, bulky animals. Just sort of making up an example. But that's crossbreeding, and you can do that with animals and plants. So same thing like with different tomatoes, right? And this goes back hundreds, even thousands of years. If you grew 10 different tomato plants, and of all the tomatoes that came off the plants, you selected the biggest, juiciest, most robust tomatoes, and you also selected them from the healthiest plants, and those were the seeds that you saved to plant again next year. We call that selective breeding because what we're trying to do there is really select the desirable traits of those animals or of those plants. So at that level, somebody could argue, well, humans are sort of choosing the DNA of these plants that goes on into the next life cycle, right? So that kind of gets lumped, that's sort of a type of genetic modification. Genetic engineering and recombinant DNA technology sort of take it to another level where humans really start to actually go in at a microscopic level and truly select a DNA a gene on the DNA that we want to carry on into the next life cycle. In recombinant DNA technology, this is where we start to actually take genes from one type of organism and put it into the DNA of a different organism. So a lot of people start to raise red flags here because, this really feels like sort of controlling nature in a pretty unique way that humans sort of had yet to do up to modern times. So a really, really brief overview of what recombinant DNA technology does is here. So the first thing to do would be to identify sort of a desired trait. So whether that's an animal or a plant or even a microorganism, right? And one of the most common things we identify from microorganisms is pesticide resistance. So let's actually go with that example. So researchers can identify a microorganism that successfully resists pesticide, right? Pesticide. So basically a toxic substance meant to kill the microorganism. But for some reason, this microorganism survives. Well, the researchers might say, okay, that's interesting. That microorganism is surviving. Let's find the part of its DNA that allows for it to resist the pesticide and survive. So then you isolate that DNA, you splice it out of the microorganism DNA, and you put it into a host cell, so something in which you can quickly make hundreds of thousands of copies of this DNA. So that host cell is also usually going to be some sort of basic bacteria. And one of the reasons why it would be a bacteria is because they replicate so quickly. So in a matter of days, you can have hundreds of thousands of copies of this DNA. So you splice this DNA of interest into the host microorganism, culture the microorganism so that it reproduces, and you kind of get this, again, sort of gene library where you have hundreds of thousands of copies of this gene or this DNA. And then you take that DNA segment for pesticide resistance, and now you're going to put it into a plant, like your tomato plant. And so this is where we get this term, genetically modified organisms. So if you have a genetically modified tomato, it may have gone through this type of process where a segment of DNA from some sort of bacteria that allowed for pesticide resistance was spliced out, replicated, and then put into this tomato seed, and then the tomato grew. And then the tomato was able to express pesticide resistance. So then if you're out in California and you're going to grow 1 million tomatoes, on a single chunk of land, you can spray all these tomatoes now with pesticide. That's not going to kill the tomato because the tomato has pesticide resistance in its DNA. So that's one of the most common uses of this recombinant DNA technology. And it is through recombinant DNA technology that we make genetically modified organisms. Again, there's a ton of controversy currently about the healthfulness, both to humans and to the environment long term for using this type of technology in our food system and in our environments at large. So from recombinant DNA technology, we get some chemical residues, or I guess I should say it's through the use of genetically modified organisms that we wind up with such excessive chemical residue in our food system. So chemical residues, food residues, I guess you could also call them, are basically residues of chemicals that can come not only from recombinant DNA technology or the pesticides that are sprayed on genetically modified organisms, but that's one source of chemical residues. So these are residues that remain on or in a food despite, no matter how much you clean it or process it. And these chemicals can cause health-related issues. They don't necessarily, what's interesting about chemical residues is that they don't cause illness so much as they cause pretty severe symptoms, I guess. And so the symptoms can be basically damage to a certain part of the body or a certain organ system. So some of the common sites of damage that we see are the nervous system, reproductive system, meaning infertility or inability to actually carry through a healthy pregnancy, cancers in various parts of the body, and antibiotic resistance in the gut. Other places where we kind of have similar types of chemical exposures, we have things called persistent organic pollutants. So these are chemicals that get into the atmosphere from sometimes agriculture, sometimes industrial waste products, either into the air or into the water system, certainly cars and other modes of transportation. And so these chemicals are called persistent organic pollutants because they persist, meaning they exist, they continue to be present in both soil and water for very extended periods of time, often decades. We'll also talk about a concept called biomagnification, which is where, depending on kind of how you eat in the food chain, we can eat animals that actually have excessively high amounts of these persistent organic pollutants in their bodies because of how they've eaten along the food chain. I'll show you a picture of that coming up. Some other sort of chemical residues that might exist would be heavy metals. Mercury and lead are two of the most common ones. And again, these can kind of get into the environment through various forms of industry. Mercury also just exists, I'd say, somewhat naturally, like in our marine supply, so in seafood. So again, biomagnification can relate there. Plastics, so bisphenol A or BPA is one of the more common ones. That's used in cans and plastic bottles. Other industrial pollutants, so dioxins is an example, can be carcinogenic, can affect the endocrine system, so hormonal production. And then polyfluorinated chemicals are also another example of these chemical residues that can get into our food supply. Here's the picture of biomagnification. So just showing various like industrial chemical pollutants. They get into the airways, they get into the waterways. You can see this factory is like literally dumping its waste into the waterways. So what happens in biomagnification is as we kind of move up the food chain to larger and larger animals, the amount of that chemical residue becomes concentrated, just simply because this larger animal eats many smaller fish, which have already eaten the plankton, which had become contaminated by this industrial waste product, these chemical residues. So eating just the small, if a human were to eat just the small fish itself, the plankton, there's very little chemical contamination on any individual plankton. Similarly with small fish, each small fish has eaten several plankton, so they've started to accumulate more of the contaminant. But then once we eat a large fish, like a tuna fish, for example, or swordfish, that fish has eaten so many of these smaller fish that it now has quite a bit of this chemical pollutant in it. And then you, the human, goes and eats the tuna, and you've now eaten the most of this chemical pollutant. So that's biomagnification. Basically, as you move up the food chain, you get this magnification effect, this magnifying effect of the amount of contaminant in the food. A little more about pesticides. So pesticides are a type of chemical pollutant that can exist in our food supply. So pesticides, as I sort of alluded to before, are things that can be applied to crops, to plants growing for human food consumption or plants being grown for livestock food consumption. So pesticides are meant to basically kill off, as protect against, but really this word side, right, means, or term, I guess, part of the word, means to kill. So something that would kill various weeds, like other plants that you don't want around, insects, fungi, bacteria. So the point in using pesticides is to try to kill off anything else that might use up the resources that your crop would otherwise use to grow itself. So the hope is that by using pesticides, we can increase crop yield. That usually works for a certain period of years, and then after that point, usually crop production actually starts to decline because of the other sort of the larger environmental effects of the excessive use of these pesticides. So insecticides would be a type of pesticide meant to work against insects. Herbicides are meant to work against other plants, and fungicides are meant to work against fungi. Many of these might be more naturally derived, and some of them are quite literally made up in a laboratory. One of the most infamous synthetic pesticides is glyphosate, or the common name is Roundup. And you can buy Roundup like at Lowe's or Home Depot. What happens though is we're at this point, kind of I would argue a tipping point in our food production system globally, where we use so much pesticide that it's having a really damaging effect in the places where it's used and in the places where it may still remain as a contaminant on food. So we're starting to have pretty mounting evidence that exposure to glyphosate is carcinogenic. That's both exposure if the residues of glyphosate remain on the food. It's also to the people applying it. So if you go to Lowe's or Home Depot and buy a container of Roundup and you bring it home and spray it on your driveway or your patio or wherever, you're exposing yourself to a pretty well-known carcinogen. So how do we get exposed to glyphosate? So as I gave the example over here of the tomato as a genetically modified crop, and I said that what we've done in making this GMO tomato is we've given it the ability to resist pesticide. So then I gave that example of, okay, now you've got 100 million tomato plants in a very large field, and you're going to go spray them all with glyphosate, which would kill off any microorganisms that might affect or inflict the tomato plant. But the tomatoes all have pesticide resistance, so they can get covered in pesticide and manage to survive. The problem, though, is that that pesticide can remain on the tomatoes, and no matter how much you wash the tomatoes, you are likely to ingest glyphosate. Interestingly, glyphosate is also used to desiccate or dry a lot of our grains. So oftentimes we can get glyphosate exposure through eating grains. The good news is that in organic agriculture, glyphosate is not allowed. So simply just by selecting organic tomatoes or organic grains, you significantly reduce your exposure to glyphosate. However, we're talking about just the outdoors. So you could have an organic field right next to an inorganic field. And so even though the organic tomatoes were grown without glyphosate, there could literally have been wind drift at the time that glyphosate was sprayed on the adjacent field. So it's unfortunately not uncommon to still have some mild glyphosate exposure, even on some organic foods. Again, children and elderly are going to be particularly sensitive to pesticides because of their developing or waning immune systems. And it is the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, that is supposed to regulate the use of pesticides. Another sort of chemical component in our food supply are growth hormones. So again, maybe one of the more infamous is recombinant bovine growth hormone, often abbreviated RBGH. So this is a genetically engineered growth hormone that is given to cows. And this is actually a question that I love to ask, so make note here. on a test. So recombinant bovine growth hormone, growth, right? The purpose of this hormone is to make the cows grow faster and bigger. It does not mean they're healthier cows. So what happens is they will increase in muscle mass, and a lot of times it will increase their milk output. But it does not mean that we now suddenly have these, magically healthy cows that suddenly just make endless amounts of milk and have endlessly large muscles. It's actually really damaging, perhaps not surprisingly once you think about it, it's actually really damaging to these animals. If you force an animal to grow really quickly, to grow really large really quickly, you basically create this animal that's much more susceptible to disease, sort of more frail in a way, because all of a sudden it just has massive amounts of muscle, but it may not have the frame to actually account for all of that muscle. So we see a lot of issues arising from use of recombinant bovine growth hormone. One of the major things is an inflammation of the udders and nipples of the cows. And again, as I said, it increases the susceptibility of these animals to disease. So we often see increased use of antibiotics given to these animals. And we then, an even further subsequent issue that arises is the rise of antibiotic resistant strains of bacteria. So you might be familiar with methicillin resistant bacteria, specifically methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus, which is commonly called MRSA. So interestingly, just by using this growth hormone and trying to do good for business and produce more meat more rapidly or more milk more rapidly, it sort of comes back to bite us in the butt. And now we get these really sick animals who get overdosed with antibiotics. And now we create this environment for antibiotic resistant bacterial strains to develop. And then we get these really bad spreads of antibiotic resistant infections, not just in cows, but also in humans. So maybe not surprisingly, some other parts of the world have actually banned the use of recombinant bovine growth hormone because they can see with plain eyes how damaging this is, not just to the cows, but also to the ecosystem at large, of which humans are a part. Another issue with use of recombinant bovine growth hormone, not just the antibiotic resistant bacteria, but also we start to see that these cows then produce even more insulin-like growth factor, and humans who consume the milk or the muscle, the meat of these cows, may also produce more insulin-like growth factor, which may be a cause of cancer development in the person eating these animals and their milk. So then a little less dooming, I guess, of a picture. There's long been a push for doing agriculture differently. So there's long been a push for organic agriculture, and even the organic movement has changed, has evolved quite a bit in the last maybe 30, 40, 50 years even. So this slide will talk more about what organic agriculture looks like here in the 21st century. So organic agriculture is now, well, I guess it has long been a set of practices, both cultural practices, biological practices, mechanical practices of agriculture that focus on recycling of resources, maintaining overall ecological health, and conserving biodiversity. So it's sort of agriculture that sees the system more broadly rather than just looks at agriculture as a means of business and making money. Anywhere that we are doing agriculture or engaging in agricultural practices, we're doing it in the context of many different ecosystems, the largest of which is just the global ecosystem of this planet. So organic agriculture acknowledges that and tries to take into consideration the fact that we can't just look at the cow, or just look at the chicken, or just look at the pig, or just look at the tomato and the glyphosate. We actually have to look at these things in the context of the environment at large, again, of which humans are a part. So in the 21st century, there are lots of different organic regulating bodies or organizations. One of the perhaps most obvious, I guess, would be the USDA Commission on Organic Agriculture. But you might notice, if you start to sort of look for it on different food packages, you might notice something, an abbreviation COOF. So there's an increasingly common like organic agriculture regulation that comes out of California, the state of California. There's another that comes out of Oregon, the state of Oregon. And so they all will have slightly different regulations. And you as the consumer are welcome to kind of go and research what the California organics has to say and what it means to have their label on a food. Same with Oregon Tilth, and also with USDA organics. In this lecture, we're going to really just focus on USDA organics, but if you're interested in this subject, there's kind of an endless world out there, so you can certainly go and read more about different organic regulatory organizations around the country. So by definition of USDA organic, many things are banned and cannot be used if you want to be able, if you as a food producer or farmer want to be able to put the USDA organic symbol on your food. So genetically modified organisms cannot be used if you're going to produce organic food. Also, most pesticides are prohibited, especially synthetic pesticides that includes glyphosate, cannot be used. Foods cannot be irradiated, sewage sludge cannot be used, synthetic fertilizers cannot be used, growth hormones cannot be used, and antibiotics cannot be used. So what this means, again, sort of taking a look at the bigger picture, promoting ecological balance, conserving biodiversity, what we're doing is in organic agriculture is trying to remove toxic and persistent pollutants, right? Because, you know, if we're just looking at, you know, raising a cow as fast as you can to slaughter it so we can eat its meat and the business can make more money, you don't care what happens to the environment at large. But in order to do that, in order to force these cows to grow so quickly, we sort of have to sacrifice somewhere. And unfortunately, where we sacrifice is at the larger environmental level. There are also some regulations around what the animals can and cannot eat if we're talking organic animal agriculture. So their food has to be 100% organic. And there's a lot of controversy here, but they have to be given access to the outdoors. And unfortunately, a lot of times that can literally mean like an access point, sometimes through which the animal cannot fit, unfortunately. So the organic, the USDA organic regulation, you know, moves us along, I think, in a productive way, but it's certainly not, it certainly could be improved itself. There's some controversy around, or some argumentation, I should say, as to whether or not organic foods are more nutritious. We actually see, if you're interested in looking at this more, and I can put a link, but the Rodale Institute, which is down somewhere south of us, Virginia maybe. The Rodale Institute actually does some really cool research comparing both crop production, crop yield, and crop nutrition on organic tracts of land compared to more conventional practices using herbicides and pesticides and growth hormones, etc. And what they find, because they've been looking at this now for more than 30 years, is that in the long run, actually, organic lands that are farmed under organic practices long-term do produce more nutritious food and do produce higher yields long-term. So that's sort of the shift too in the mindset, is looking at the next 5 years, or looking at the next 50 years, or the next 100 years, right? And so Yeah, sometimes in the short term, in the first year or two, conventional agriculture might outproduce an organic field. But after that, the organic field will begin to greatly surpass production and often nutrition, because again, you're recycling resources, you're restoring nutrition to the soil after you use it to produce your crops. And then again, just highlighting here that organic foods generally are safer. So if you're interested in reducing your exposure to chemical residues through food, then choosing organic is definitely something that will help you get there. So this is a little more about the USDA organic labeling program. So some of the words that you might see on a food package: 100% organic, organic, or made with organic ingredients. So if it's 100% organic, then literally every ingredient has to be organically produced under the guidance and the regulation of these organic principles. If it just says organic, so if the food says it's organic, it means that 95% of the ingredients were produced under organic methods. And this is interesting, the other 5% must not have been available in organic form. So you can only sort of get away with this if you chose some of those inorganic ingredients because an organic version wasn't available. And then you might see made with organic ingredients, and that means that, you know, roughly 2/3 of it were organic. And then this is, so you can look for this symbol on your foods. I'll put a link to the California organics and the Oregon organics, so you can also take a look at those. And I will also, I don't think I put it in lecture, but if you're interested in reducing your intake of genetically modified organisms, you can also look for the non-GMO verified project sticker. This is super helpful too for anybody, I think for all of us, to reduce our pesticide exposure in fruits and vegetables. So this comes from the Environmental Working Group as sort of the Clean 15 and the Dirty Dozen list. Maybe you've heard of this before. Actually, here's a link here too, but I'll put this up on this week's content. So the Environmental Working Group has done a lot of research to see where we have the most exposure to pesticides on our food. And so what it shows is that these 12 foods, if they're grown under conventional methods, retain the highest amount of pesticide on their skin or in their flesh. So what this list is suggesting then is, if possible, buy these foods organic, because then you're going to completely erase your exposure, or at least greatly reduce your exposure to pesticides. So apples, celery, cherries, grapes, nectarines, peaches, pears, potatoes, spinach, strawberries, sweet bell peppers, and tomatoes. Whereas on the right side, they call this the Clean 15 list. So these are the foods that, even if they're grown under conventional methods and they are exposed to pesticides, the amount of pesticide that remains on the food is relatively low. So you can still buy these foods not organic and probably save yourself a little money and still not have to worry too much about your exposure to the pesticide. So asparagus, avocado, broccoli, cabbage, cantaloupe, cauliflower, eggplant, honeydew melon, kiwi, mango, onion, papaya, pineapple, sweet corn, and sweet peas. So this, I think, is just a really helpful shopping guide. Oh, I didn't realize that was the last page. Yeah, so relatively short lecture here. Again, just sort of introducing you, as this course is called Introduction to Nutrition, really just starting to brush the surface of a lot of these different topics within the large field of nutrition. So my suggestion, I guess, if you want to continue in nutrition or public health, I think this is an area that needs the greatest amount of resources and the greatest attention right now. As I said earlier, I think we're kind of at a tipping point with the way we are producing food, both domestically and internationally. And I think we need to take a good hard look and actually make some pretty substantial changes to how we produce food and what we choose to eat. So with that, hopefully you're interested in sort of pursuing this maybe in your academic studies and future careers. But this whole conversation around our food system and our food supply and how it's affecting both humans, animals, and the environment at large, I think is at a point of being critical right now. So with that, as always, here are your review questions. You can mute me and take some time to kind of look over these. And as always, email me with any questions. And I will see you next time.